She rolled into a cafe asking to pay later. He was a ruthless billionaire who never cared about anyone. But one act of kindness unraveled a secret that would change his legacy forever, and give him the family he never knew he needed. Before we get started, leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching from so we can say hello to you. Now, on to the story. Brandon Whitmore had everything most men only dreamed of. At 45, he commanded Wall Street like a war general, respected, feared, unstoppable. From his sprawling penthouse 80 stories above Manhattan, he watched the world with the same calculating eyes that had made him a billionaire before most men reached middle age. But beneath the tailored suits, the press photos, and the headlines, there was nothing. Just silence. The penthouse was 10,000 square feet of cold perfection, marble floors that echoed with emptiness, priceless art pieces that stared back blankly, and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed a city he no longer felt connected to. No family photos adorned the walls. No laughter ever lingered in the air. Just the quiet hum of automated lights and the soft whisper of the HVAC system keeping his world sterile. He paced the hallway that morning, the click of his Italian leather shoes the only sound. On the phone, his voice was ice. "Cancel dinner with the Tokyo investors," he ordered. "Double the offer. I don't have time to negotiate." His assistant stammered an acknowledgement, used to the last-minute commands that came without warning or warmth. Brandon ended the call without saying goodbye, sliding the phone into his coat pocket with the precision of habit. He paused at the window, catching his own reflection, silver at the temples, jaw sharp, shoulders stiff with tension. He looked powerful. Untouchable. But even he couldn't deny the emptiness tightening around him like a noose. His empire was thriving, his net worth soaring. But the man behind the mirror looked like a ghost of someone who once believed in more than numbers and power. And for the first time in a long while, Brandon felt it, a flicker. The quiet ache of something missing. Something he couldn't name. Not yet. The rain hadn't yet started, but the clouds outside Westside Cafe hung low and heavy with the weight of it. Brandon Whitmore stepped out of his black SUV, his driver holding the door as if on instinct. Clad in a navy wool coat over a perfectly tailored gray suit, Brandon's every movement was crisp, measured, and intentional. Even this routine morning coffee stop was embedded into his schedule with surgical precision. Inside, the cafe buzzed with its usual energy, hushed conversations, laptop screens glowing, the hiss of steamers behind the counter. Brandon moved through the familiar scene, indifferent to the crowd. His mind was already drifting to a looming European acquisition that could double the firm's quarterly returns. Everything around him faded into background noise. Until it didn't. A subtle shift in energy rippled through the line ahead of him. It stalled, unusual for a place known for its lightning-speed service. Brandon's eyes narrowed, mildly irritated. But then he heard a soft voice, steady but tinged with strain. "I can bring the rest tomorrow. I promise." Brandon leaned slightly, trying to see past the businessman in front of him. At the register stood a young girl, no older than 9. She was in a wheelchair, an older model, with faded upholstery and scuffed wheels. Her clothes were clean, but threadbare. A too-thin jacket clung to her small frame, and her brown hair was pulled back tightly in a ponytail. Her hands trembled slightly as she extended a small handful of wrinkled dollar bills toward the cashier. The woman behind the counter looked apologetic, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm sorry, sweetie. This just isn't enough." Brandon caught himself exhaling sharply. The girl didn't cry. She didn't beg. Her back remained straight, her chin lifted. There was pride there, in the way she held herself, stubborn pride built on survival. Other customers shuffled, uncomfortable, pretending not to notice but clearly wanting the scene to end. That was the world Brandon had ruled for years, a world that averted its eyes from anything inconvenient. But he couldn't look away. "Add her purchase to mine," Brandon heard himself say, stepping forward before he had time to think. The words landed heavily in the air. The girl turned to face him, her blue eyes wide with surprise. "You don't have to do that, sir," she said, her voice quiet but direct, not at all the timid tone he expected. "I know," Brandon replied, his voice unexpectedly soft. Something about her gaze, the way she didn't flinch from him, the way she met him with dignity rather than gratitude, struck a nerve deep in his chest. It was as if, in that one moment, someone had cracked open a piece of his carefully barricaded soul. The cashier nodded gratefully and rang up the order. Brandon paid without looking at the receipt, still caught in the intensity of the girl's presence. He could feel the stares on his back, of curiosity, confusion, even admiration. But he didn't care. His eyes were still on the girl. She straightened slightly in her wheelchair, as if trying to regain the bit of power she'd just lost by accepting help. "Thank you," she said quietly. Brandon crouched slightly to meet her at eye level, the first real break in his Wall Street armor in years. "Where are your parents?" he asked softly. The girl's expression changed. Just for a moment, a flicker of pain cut through her poised demeanor. "They died," she said, simple and direct. "I'm Lily Evans." She held out her hand, firm, formal, like she was used to introducing herself in places where she didn't belong. Brandon took it, momentarily stunned by her composure. "Brandon Whitmore," he replied automatically. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, tapping against the cafe windows like 1,000 tiny drums. Lily glanced toward the door, then at her wheels, then at the little backpack slung over the back of her chair. He could read it all on her face. She didn't want help, but she had no idea where she was going to sleep tonight. And neither did he, really. Not anymore. Not now that he'd seen her. He knew he could walk away, and no one would question it. He'd done it 1,000 times before, with deals, with people, with problems too messy to fix. But today, something held him in place. And that something had a name, Lily Evans. As he turned to leave, the usual clarity that guided his mornings had vanished, replaced with something unfamiliar. A feeling he hadn't experienced in years, maybe decades. Guilt? Compassion? No, it was something simpler. Something more dangerous. It was connection. And Brandon Whitmore, a man who had cut off more connections than he could count, suddenly found himself standing at a crossroads he never saw coming, all because a little girl in a wheelchair asked to pay later for a cookie she couldn't afford. The rain had turned relentless. Sheets of water hammered the cafe windows, blurring the city into a gray, trembling watercolor. Brandon Whitmore stood under the cafe's overhang, his tailored coat shielding little more than his pride as the wind whipped through Manhattan's Upper West Side. He should have left 10 minutes ago. His driver was waiting. His inbox was waiting. Wall Street never paused, and neither did Brandon Whitmore. But he didn't move. Just inside the cafe, the little girl in the wheelchair sat quietly near the window, her tray holding a simple hot chocolate and a small muffin, courtesy of Brandon's spontaneous act of charity. Or was it conscience? Lily Evans. She had introduced herself with startling poise earlier. Eyes too sharp, voice too steady for a child who had just admitted to being orphaned. There was an unspoken grace in the way she held herself, like someone who'd learned early not to ask for help because help rarely came. Brandon glanced at the sidewalk. The rain wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Rivers of runoff rushed down the curbs. Puddles grew into lakes. The kind of weather that made even healthy adults retreat indoors. And Lily? She didn't even have a proper coat. As if sensing his gaze, she turned her head. Her eyes met his through the glass, blue, bright, and impossibly clear. He recognized something in them. Not just desperation, defiance. She wasn't hoping someone would rescue her. She was daring the world not to break her. He stepped back into the cafe. "Do you have somewhere to go?" he asked gently. She blinked up at him, surprised but not startled. "I'm fine," she replied. "I've been through worse." The lie wasn't in the words, it was in the slight tremble of her fingers as she adjusted the zipper on her thin jacket. Brandon followed her eyes to the sidewalk, then to the backpack hooked to her wheelchair. Small. Worn. Everything she owned, likely stuffed inside. "You'll get soaked," he said after a pause. "I've gotten soaked before." "That doesn't mean you should again." Lily tilted her head, studying him the way a grown-up might assess a contract, skeptical of hidden terms. "Why would you help me?" He didn't have a good answer. Only a feeling. A pull. A memory he couldn't quite name. "Because today," he said slowly, "you need it. That's enough reason for now." The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken fears and fragile trust. Then she nodded, barely perceptible, but enough. Brandon turned to the counter, spoke briefly into his phone, and a sleek black town car rolled up moments later, the driver leaping out to assist. As the driver carefully folded the wheelchair ramp down and helped Lily into the vehicle, Brandon's gaze lingered on her face. She didn't look relieved. She looked braced, for disappointment, for ulterior motives, for the other shoe to drop. "I'm not taking you far," he reassured her. "Just to my place. You can dry off, get warm, eat something real. That's all." Lily held his eyes for a long moment before nodding again. As the door clicked shut behind her, and Brandon stepped in beside her, something shifted inside him. It wasn't just kindness, it was surrender. To a truth he hadn't realized until now. He wasn't rescuing her. She was saving him. And in that quiet, rainy corner of Manhattan, Brandon Whitmore, titan of finance, began to discover just how empty his empire had become. The elevator chimed softly as it opened into the sprawling penthouse of Brandon Whitmore. Mrs. Foster, the housekeeper who had worked for Brandon for over 15 years, stood in the grand foyer, feather duster in hand, expecting to see him alone, as always. But when the doors parted, her mouth dropped slightly open. "A child. In a wheelchair." "Mr. Whitmore?" she asked, her Scottish accent thickening in surprise. Brandon looked vaguely uncomfortable. "This is Lily Evans. She needed shelter from the rain." Mrs. Foster recovered quickly, her years of professionalism snapping into place. She offered a kind smile. "Well then, dearie, let's get you warmed up." Brandon stood still for a moment, watching the contrast. His housekeeper, his constant, reliable fixture in a sterile home, now kneeling in front of a child, gently adjusting the wet strands of her hair, speaking in soft, maternal tones. It was a scene so foreign to this place that it struck Brandon like a slap of cold water. He glanced around. The penthouse, once the crown jewel of his success, now looked utterly ridiculous. Polished marble floors. Sharp-edged Italian furniture no child could lean against. Narrow hallways. 3 imposing steps leading down to the sunken living room. And the oversized door frames, designed to impress guests, now seemed to mock the small figure in the wheelchair. He had spent millions creating this fortress of prestige, yet somehow, it had never occurred to him that someone might need to live in it. "It's not exactly," he began, unsure what he was even trying to say. Mrs. Foster, reading the tension, stepped in. "Perhaps the kitchen would be more comfortable? More accessible?" "Yes," Brandon said too quickly, grateful for the out. "Good idea." The 3 of them moved through the service hallway toward the kitchen. Mrs. Foster guided the wheelchair with practiced grace, clearly already adapting. Brandon followed behind, silent and rattled. The kitchen was a warmer space, slightly less pretentious, a little more human. The hum of the refrigerator, the smell of citrus-scented floor cleaner, and the presence of worn wooden cabinets softened the sterile chill that pervaded the rest of the home. As Mrs. Foster bustled about preparing hot chocolate and sandwiches, Lily finally relaxed. Her thin shoulders, which had been tight with tension since stepping inside, eased as warmth seeped back into her limbs. Brandon stood awkwardly by the granite island, watching her from a distance. She looked even smaller in this kitchen than she had outside. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the mug of cocoa, but her grip was steady. There was something about the way she held herself, graceful, proud even, that made her seem older than her years. "Do you live alone in this whole big place?" she asked suddenly, looking up at him with those penetrating blue eyes. "Yes," Brandon replied, then added, "It's convenient for work." She nodded slowly, then looked around. "It's very shiny." Mrs. Foster let out a short laugh she quickly muffled, but Brandon didn't mind. In fact, for the first time in years, he welcomed it. He watched as Lily sipped her cocoa, eating with deliberate restraint, as if afraid of being judged. She had clearly learned not to assume kindness from strangers, even the ones offering warm kitchens and sandwiches. Something twisted in his gut. The chair she sat in was too high. The island was too wide. The doorways too narrow. Nothing in his home fit her, not physically, not emotionally. And yet, here she was, fitting into his life more naturally than any of the associates who dined here over $10,000 bottles of wine. In that moment, Brandon understood something with piercing clarity: the house wasn't the problem. He was. He had built a life no one could belong in. And Lily, drenched from the rain, orphaned, but impossibly resilient, was the first person who'd made him want to change that. Mrs. Foster, ever efficient, had laid out sandwiches, cut diagonally and arranged with practiced care. Lily stared at them for a moment before finally reaching for one. She took a delicate bite, trying to appear composed, but Brandon noticed how quickly the second and third followed. Hunger, like everything else about her, was tucked beneath a layer of poise. "You live here all by yourself?" she asked, glancing around the sleek space with curiosity. Brandon nodded. "Yes. It's convenient for work," he added, instantly regretting the banality of the comment. Lily nodded slowly. "It's very shiny," she said after a pause, her voice neutral, but her gaze was sharp. There was no childlike wonder in her tone, just observation. Awareness. She saw things most adults missed. Brandon looked away, uncertain how to respond. Silence stretched between them before he finally asked, "Where have you been staying, Lily?" She swallowed the last bit of sandwich before replying, "Different places. Sometimes shelters, when there's room." "And your parents?" he asked, already fearing the answer. Her voice grew mechanical, rehearsed, like she had told the story too many times to people who didn't really care. "Car accident. Last year. I was at school when it happened. That's also when I got hurt. My back, my legs." She shrugged with a forced casualness. "Doctor said I might walk again someday, with therapy." Might. That word echoed in Brandon's head like a stone dropped in a well. He studied her, searching for cracks in the composure she worked so hard to maintain. Her blue eyes, clear and steady, met his. But behind the calm surface, he saw shadows. She was tired, more tired than any child should ever be. "Surely," he began, cautiously, "there must be relatives." "None that wanted me," she said flatly. Brandon inhaled sharply. Her words weren't bitter, they were resigned. That made it worse. Lily took another sip of her cocoa, her expression unreadable. "People don't usually keep me around long. It's always temporary. Until something changes. Or someone gets uncomfortable." Brandon didn't know what disturbed him more, the fact that this child spoke like she'd aged decades in a single year, or the truth of what she was saying. She had clearly learned the art of self-preservation, of not expecting too much. He stood, pacing toward the window, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Outside, traffic flowed steadily below, the city unaware that anything had changed in the world above. This wasn't his problem to solve. He had businesses to run, board meetings to chair, markets to outmaneuver. And yet, here was this girl, this brave, battle-worn child, stirring feelings he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Duty, guilt, protectiveness, humanity. When he turned back, Lily had finished her meal. She sat upright in her wheelchair, quietly watching him. "Are you going to call someone to take me?" she asked, her voice quiet, but her eyes unreadably steady. He opened his mouth, then closed it. "Not tonight," he said finally. "The storm's getting worse." Mrs. Foster, wiping her hands on a dish towel, exchanged a glance with him but said nothing. She simply nodded and began preparing the guest room. As Lily wheeled herself to the hallway, Brandon realized something that sent a chill through his spine. He wasn't just opening his home. He was opening the door to something far riskier, connection. And once opened, he wasn't sure it could be closed again. Brandon Whitmore stood alone in the far corner of his penthouse office, his reflection fractured across the rain-streaked glass. Behind him, the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen told him that Mrs. Foster and Lily were still finishing their late lunch. The aroma of grilled cheese and tomato soup, simple, comforting, felt alien in the sterile, art-curated space he called home. The phone in his hand felt heavy. He stared at it, debating. He had always prided himself on making quick, precise decisions. In business, hesitation was weakness. But this wasn't a boardroom negotiation or an acquisition. This was a child. A 9-year-old girl in a wheelchair who had nowhere to go. A girl with steady eyes, too much loss in her voice, and a quiet strength that had somehow slipped beneath the armor he'd spent decades building. He tapped the screen and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for the Department of Social Services. It was the right thing to do. The responsible, legal step. She needed trained professionals, not a man who barely remembered how to talk to children, let alone care for one. His thumb hovered over the green call button. He pressed it. A woman answered on the third ring, her tone efficient, impersonal. "Child Services Intake, this is Denise." Brandon cleared his throat. "I'm calling regarding a minor, Lily Evans. She's in my temporary care. I found her yesterday during a rainstorm. She was alone outside a cafe." Denise's voice softened slightly. "Thank you for reaching out, sir. Is the child in immediate danger?" "No," Brandon said. "She's safe. Federal warm. But she's alone. No known family. Disabled." There was a pause. "We'll begin an intake file. She'll be placed in emergency housing until a more permanent solution is found. I should tell you, group homes for children with medical needs are often at capacity. She may be transferred more than once." More than once. Brandon looked out the window again. The city glowed beneath the storm, headlights streaking like comets through the wet streets. He imagined Lily in one of those government-run facilities, sleeping in a shared room with strangers, her wheelchair wedged between cots. No books. No quiet. No one who cared if she made it through the night with her dignity intact. "She has a spinal injury," Brandon heard himself say. "Can your facilities support that?" There was another pause. "We accommodate all children, sir. But resources are limited." Of course they were. After ending the call, Brandon stood motionless. The silence pressed in on him. He stared at his desk, clean, polished, untouched for days. He had billion-dollar companies. A luxury car downstairs. Original Rothkos on the walls. But at that moment, none of it could buy what Lily needed most: stability. Safety. A place where she was wanted. He turned from the window and walked back to the kitchen. Mrs. Foster was helping Lily wash her hands at the sink, laughing at something the girl had said. Lily looked up when she saw Brandon. Her face, still pale, brightened slightly. But something in her eyes shifted when she saw his expression. Is someone coming to take me away? She asked quietly. Brandon opened his mouth. Closed it. Then, finally, not tonight. Lily's shoulders relaxed, but her eyes never left his face. She was reading him, like a business rival across the table. Mrs. Foster met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. I'll prepare the guest room, she said, and left. Brandon knelt beside Lily. The storm's getting worse. I thought, you could stay here, at least for now. She nodded slowly. Okay. As he wheeled her toward the elevator, something deep in his chest cracked open. Brandon Whitmore, the man who once measured success in market caps and mergers, had just made the most irrational, and human, decision of his life. And somehow, it felt like the first truly right one. Brandon Whitmore stood in the doorway of his home office, watching as Lily leaned over the kitchen table, her small fingers tracing the edges of a worn silver locket. She wore it constantly, clasped tight around her neck like a lifeline. He had noticed her touching it when she was nervous, or when the subject of her parents came up. That evening, under the soft light of the chandelier, she opened it briefly to glance at the photograph inside. And Brandon caught a glimpse. His breath stalled. May I see that? He asked gently, stepping into the room. Lily blinked up at him, clearly surprised, but not frightened. Slowly, she undid the clasp and handed the locket over. Inside, two faces smiled back at him. One was clearly Lily's mother, youthful and glowing. The other. Brandon's stomach dropped. The man had tousled dark hair, a wide grin, and eyes so unmistakably familiar that Brandon nearly stumbled backward. He had seen that face before. Not in passing. Not in memory. But in his past. Matthew Whitmore. His estranged younger brother. The realization hit like a punch to the chest. Brandon sat down across from Lily, the locket still open in his hand, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. Lily, who is this man? He asked, voice strained. She looked at the photo. That's my dad. James Evans. He married my mom, Rebecca. He died in the same accident. Brandon swallowed. Did your mom ever mention anyone named Matthew Whitmore? Lily shook her head. No. But I was little. I don't remember everything. Why? Brandon hesitated. The resemblance was too strong. The man in the photo wasn't just familiar, he was a mirror of the brother Brandon hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. The last time they spoke, they argued about responsibility, about how Matthew never took life seriously. And then, 3 months later, Matthew died in a car crash. Alone. Unforgiven. Was it possible Matthew had a child no one knew about? Was it possible Lily was that child? The questions swirled in Brandon's mind, chaotic and relentless. Every logical voice screamed for restraint, for caution, but his instincts, rarely wrong, whispered a dangerous truth: she might be your niece. Before he could speak again, the elevator chimed. Vanessa. Brandon's niece and presumed heir strode in with her usual designer heels clicking against the marble floors. She was mid-sentence about the Dawson merger when she saw Lily seated at the table with a glass of milk and a peanut butter sandwich. She froze. Her eyes narrowed. Who is this? She demanded. Brandon rose, placing the locket back in Lily's hands. Vanessa, this is Lily Evans. She's staying here for a while. Vanessa's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. You brought a child into the penthouse? Without a nanny? Without clearance? She needed help, Brandon replied flatly. Vanessa looked Lily over with the scrutiny of a corporate audit. Uncle Brandon, we need to talk. Now. Brandon followed her into his study. She closed the door sharply. Have you lost your mind? She hissed. Do you have any idea what this looks like? A child? Off the street? Living here? The press will crucify you. The board. This is none of their concern, Brandon said coldly. It's all their concern. Everything you do reflects on Montgomery Investments. You can't just bring in some random girl. She's not random, Brandon said, voice rising slightly. Vanessa caught the shift. What are you not telling me? Brandon didn't answer. Not yet. Not until he was certain. But in that moment, a door inside him opened that had been locked for years. Lily might not just be a girl he helped. She might be family. And that changed everything. Brandon Whitmore had always been immune to emotion in the boardroom. The numbers didn't care about feelings, and neither did he. Or at least, that's what he told himself for the past 20 years. But something had shifted since Lily arrived. That morning, as he stood by the windows of his office, looking out at the Manhattan skyline, he couldn't stop replaying the moment he first saw her in the cafe. That moment had upended everything. He didn't hear the elevator ding, nor the sharp click of heels approaching until his office door burst open. Uncle Brandon, Vanessa Whitmore's voice rang out, her tone clipped with irritation. Brandon turned slowly. Vanessa, he said with a calmness he didn't feel. She never showed up without an appointment. We need to talk. Now. Vanessa was 35, sharp as broken glass, and had spent the last decade positioning herself as the heir to the Whitmore legacy. She had weathered hostile takeovers, dodged media scandals, and clawed her way to executive vice president at Whitmore Holdings. But now, she looked genuinely rattled. I've been trying to reach you for days. The Dawson merger is falling apart, and instead of returning calls, you're playing house? Brandon's jaw tightened. If you're referring to Lily, she's staying with me temporarily. Vanessa scoffed. You brought a child, off the street, into your home? Have you lost your mind? Brandon folded his arms. She's not just some child. She needed help. That may be true, but you're Harrison Whitmore. Everything you do has implications. This story is already making waves. You think our investors won't ask questions when the media is calling this a breakdown or a midlife crisis? I don't care what they call it, he said, his voice low. She's not a project. She's a person. Vanessa stared at him, her eyes calculating. Is this about your brother? Is this guilt over Matthew? Brandon's breath hitched. This has nothing to do with Matthew, he lied. Vanessa narrowed her eyes. I don't believe that. You've never cared about children, or anyone outside of profit margins. Now suddenly, you're cooking breakfast and building ramps in your penthouse? I'm doing what needs to be done, Brandon snapped. If you can't see that, then perhaps you're not as in touch with the family as you pretend to be. Her face darkened, the insult landing harder than he intended. This won't go away quietly, Uncle. The board is already asking questions. If you continue down this path, you risk everything we've built. We? Brandon's voice grew sharp. What exactly have you built, Vanessa? A career on my name? A reputation based on distance and calculation? Don't lecture me on risk when you've never once risked your heart. A tense silence settled between them, thick with old resentments and unspoken truths. I'm calling a press conference, she said coldly. The company needs to get ahead of this narrative. Do what you must, Brandon said, suddenly weary. But understand this, I'm not sending Lily away. If you try to interfere again, I will fight you. Not as your uncle. As her guardian. Vanessa turned on her heel, leaving without another word. Brandon sank into his leather chair, heart pounding. Outside, the city roared with its usual indifference, but inside, everything had changed. He looked at the framed photograph on his desk, Matthew on a boat, carefree and laughing, the way he used to be before everything fell apart. Was Lily really his daughter? Could she be? The thought haunted him. And if it was true, then bloodlines weren't just metaphor anymore. They were real. And they were sitting in his kitchen, eating toast and changing his entire world. The sun had long dipped beneath the New York skyline when Brandon Whitmore sat by Lily's bedside, his usually composed expression fractured with worry. Her small form lay still under the plush navy covers, her skin pale, her breathing shallow. Only hours earlier, she'd seemed tired but fine. Now her forehead burned with fever, her body trembling with an invisible force that Brandon couldn't control, something that terrified him far more than any market crash or boardroom ambush ever had. He had called Dr. Bennett the moment Lily complained of dizziness. The private physician arrived within 20 minutes, his leather bag snapping open on the edge of the bed. Brandon watched, helpless, as the doctor examined Lily with practiced urgency. "She has a significant fever," Dr. Bennett murmured, his brow furrowing. "Given her medical history and fragile immune system, this isn't something we can treat casually." Brandon felt something cold sink in his chest. "Do whatever you need," he said, voice low but firm. Dr. Bennett nodded and began drawing blood for lab work. As he did, he glanced between Lily and Brandon with subtle curiosity. "You know," the doctor said quietly, "there's something about her. She reminds me of your brother. The eyes. That sharp way she watches everything." Brandon blinked. He had noticed it, of course, those piercing blue eyes, the way she tilted her head when thinking. Edward's eyes. But hearing it spoken aloud hit him like a freight train. "You knew Matthew well," Brandon said, his voice quieter now. "Well enough to recognize his stare," the doctor replied, taping the gauze to Lily's arm. As Dr. Bennett left to run the tests, Brandon stood frozen beside the bed. The thought he'd been avoiding, the suspicion he hadn't dared speak, now loomed too large to ignore. Could Lily be Matthew's daughter? An hour later, the test results arrived electronically, and Dr. Bennett returned with grim determination etched across his face. "Brandon," he said, holding his tablet, "I ran a preliminary DNA comparison using your blood from your last physical and Lily's from tonight." Brandon's stomach tightened. "And?" "The results suggest a close familial relationship. Not parent-child. But uncle to niece would fit." The world tilted for a moment. Everything, the kindness that had pulled him to her, the locket she clutched so tightly, the familiar mannerisms, clicked into place like a puzzle that had been missing one final piece. "She's Matthew's child," Brandon whispered. Saying it made it real. "I believe so," the doctor confirmed. "And Brandon, we need to act quickly. Her condition is worse than I initially suspected. Her body's exhausted, her immune system weakened from months of poor nutrition and inadequate care." Brandon turned back toward Lily, her small body seeming impossibly fragile against the grand scale of his guest suite. The irony was cruel, all his wealth, all his power, and yet this child, his niece, had been left vulnerable for so long. "How do we help her?" he asked. "She needs a blood transfusion," Dr. Bennett replied. "Her blood type is rare, and with a specific antigen profile. We'll check the registry, but—" "Test me," Brandon interrupted. "Brandon. Now. If I'm a match, we don't wait." The doctor nodded, appreciating the resolve in Brandon's voice. As his own blood was drawn for compatibility testing, Brandon sat back down beside Lily, taking her hand in his. The fire in her skin still frightened him, but the fire in her spirit was unmistakable. The little girl he had helped in a coffee shop was more than a chance encounter, she was family. He hadn't just taken in a child in need. He had brought home his brother's daughter. And he wasn't going to lose her. Not now. Not ever. The silence in the penthouse that night was different. Not the cold, pristine kind Brandon Whitmore was used to, this one was warm, heavy, almost sacred. The kind of silence that wraps itself around something sacred, something new. Lily was sleeping in the guest room, her fever down, her breathing steady, her little fingers still curled around the edge of her lavender blanket. Just hours earlier, Brandon had learned the truth: she wasn't just some girl who needed help. She was family. His niece. The daughter of Matthew Whitmore, his younger brother. The brother he hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. The brother he'd buried without knowing the most important truth of all, that he had left behind a child. Brandon sat alone in his dimly lit study, staring at the DNA results spread across his desk. The numbers and charts meant little. But the conclusion at the bottom, bold and unmistakable, had rocked him to the core: genetic relationship consistent with paternal uncle/niece. It explained everything. The eyes. The stubborn way she questioned him. The way she processed the world with an intellect too sharp for her age. She wasn't just Lily Evans. She was Lily Whitmore. His brother's blood. His blood. A low, bitter laugh escaped him as he thought about how blind he'd been. All his life, Brandon had measured value in profit margins, quarterly earnings, and calculated risks. But none of those things had prepared him for what it meant to sit beside a hospital bed and realize that his legacy wasn't in steel towers or billion-dollar mergers. It was a child. The next morning, Brandon moved with clarity he hadn't felt in years. He summoned the lead architect from his firm's private design team. "I want the penthouse retrofitted," he said without preamble. "Wider doorways, accessible bathrooms, ramps to the sunken living room. I don't want Lily confined to any corner of this house." The architect blinked, stunned. "Sir, that's going to require major modifications. Structural changes. Then start today." Downstairs, Mrs. Foster had already adapted her routine to Lily's needs. Brandon joined them for breakfast, an act unheard of until now. As Lily cautiously poured pancake batter under Mrs. Foster's supervision, Brandon watched her, truly watched her. The delicate concentration on her face. The pride in each small accomplishment. The steadiness of her spirit despite all she'd endured. "You're staying here," he told her later that day, crouching beside her wheelchair. "This is your home now." Lily's blue eyes flickered with something fragile and dangerous: hope. "Even with the media saying things? Even with your niece angry?" "Yes," he said. "Especially because of that." Vanessa was furious. Her PR spin had backfired, and now she'd gone silent after the DNA confirmation. But Brandon didn't care. Not anymore. Let the board whisper. Let the press speculate. For the first time, his conscience outweighed their expectations. He called an emergency executive meeting. "I'm restructuring," he told them. 3 days a week, I'll work from home. Effective immediately. I've appointed a chief operating officer to manage day-to-day affairs." The room went still. "Mr. Whitmore," one director began cautiously, "this is highly unorthodox." "No more than taking in my niece," Brandon replied evenly. "Lily's well-being is my new priority. And I suggest we all start thinking about what kind of company we want to be. Because the one I'm building? It includes people like her." That night, he stood at Lily's bedroom door, watching her sleep. For once, the penthouse didn't feel so empty. A billionaire who had once measured life in spreadsheets had discovered a different kind of wealth, a little girl's safety, trust, and future. He hadn't chosen this path. But now that he was on it, he would walk every step. Beside her. Forever. Brandon Whitmore thought he had seen the worst of humanity, on Wall Street, in boardrooms, across cold negotiation tables, but nothing prepared him for the gut punch he felt when Catherine, his attorney, called with a grave voice. "We have a problem," she said without preamble. "A man named Mike Evans just contacted the court. He claims to be James Evans' half-brother, Lily's biological uncle, and he's filing for custody." Brandon's blood ran cold. "We did a full background check on James. There were no known siblings," he said, his voice sharp. Half-brother. Technically accurate. From a different mother. Apparently they were estranged, but legally, he has standing, at least enough to challenge you. Brandon clenched his jaw. And why is he surfacing now? Catherine hesitated, then added, he saw the media coverage. Your name. The Montgomery fortune. It doesn't take much to put the pieces together. It didn't. The timing, the sudden concern, it all stank of opportunism. But Brandon had dealt with vultures before. He just never imagined one would come circling around a little girl who was finally beginning to feel safe. Marcus Reed, Brandon's trusted investigator, got to work immediately. Within 48 hours, he had a thick file of Mike Evans' history spread out on Brandon's office desk. 3 DUIs, sporadic jobs, multiple gambling debts. He's bounced around from Florida to Atlantic City, Marcus summarized. He approached 3 tabloids before filing for custody, offering them a tell-all story about your relationship with Lily. Brandon felt a wave of protective rage rise in his chest. He's not looking for family, Brandon said through gritted teeth. He's looking for a payout. Marcus nodded. His lawyer is small-time. Barely passed the bar. But they're betting you'll settle, throw money at the problem. Brandon leaned forward, eyes narrowed. Set up a meeting. I want to hear this man's intentions, face to face. The meeting was arranged in a sterile conference room downtown. Mike Evans showed up in a rumpled blazer and scuffed shoes, trying to play the part of concerned kin. His eyes never stayed on Lily's photograph long enough to suggest anything real. My client believes his niece deserves to be raised by blood, his attorney began. Family should stay with family. Brandon didn't flinch. Then where was this family when she was in a wheelchair, homeless and alone? Mike smirked slightly. Look, we're not here to argue. We both know you've got more money than God. 50,000, and I disappear. No custody battle. No media circus. The room went silent. Brandon rose slowly from his chair, his voice calm but icy. You're right about one thing, I have resources. Enough to ensure that anyone trying to use Lily for a quick payout lives to regret it. Mike's smirk faltered. I will fight you. In court, in the press, wherever necessary. And I will win, not because I'm rich, but because I actually care about Lily. Because I've been there when she cried in her sleep. Because I've held her hand during physical therapy. Because she is my family. The lawyer cleared his throat nervously, but Mike Evans didn't respond. His bluff had been called. He had come for a settlement and left with the terrifying certainty that Brandon Whitmore wasn't bluffing. That night, as Brandon helped Lily with her therapy exercises between the parallel bars, she glanced at him with concern. Is that man going to take me away? Brandon wrapped a steady arm around her waist as she took a shaky step. No, he said firmly. You're staying right here. But how can you be sure, she whispered. Brandon looked her squarely in the eyes. Because family isn't just blood, Lily. It's who stands beside you when you can't stand on your own. And I'm not going anywhere. Tears welled in Lily's eyes, but for the first time, they were tears of hope. The courtroom was colder than Brandon Whitmore had expected, not because of the temperature, but because of the stares, the silence, the sheer weight of what was at stake. Dressed in a dark navy suit, he sat rigidly at the wooden bench beside his attorney, Catherine Hayes, as Lily adjusted the sleeves of her soft lavender dress beside him. Her tiny fingers trembled slightly, but her chin was lifted in quiet defiance. At just 9 years old, she had faced more than most adults. Across the aisle sat Mike Evans, the self-proclaimed half-brother of James Evans, Lily's adoptive father. He wore an ill-fitting suit and a smug expression, seated beside a cheap-looking lawyer with a messy briefcase and a smirk that made Brandon's blood boil. Judge Emily Carter, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, presided from the bench. Her voice was calm but commanding. Mr. Evans, you are requesting custody of Lily Evans on the grounds of being her only living blood relative. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, Mike said, straightening in his seat. Family should raise family. Catherine stood. Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Evans has had no contact with Lily throughout her life. He only appeared after news of Mr. Whitmore's temporary guardianship went public. Judge Carter nodded. Noted. Please proceed with your evidence. What followed was a carefully constructed portrait of greed. Catherine submitted records showing Evans had multiple DUIs, gambling debts, and had recently tried to sell Lily's story to tabloid outlets. Brandon watched the judge's expression tighten. Mike Evans tried to defend himself, rambling about hard times and second chances, but nothing could erase the truth. He hadn't come for Lily, he'd come for a payout. Brandon clenched his jaw. He had remained silent long enough. Your Honor, he said, rising. May I speak? Judge Carter paused. Briefly. Brandon turned to face her, then glanced at Lily. I didn't plan for any of this. A year ago, I would have walked past Lily without seeing her. I thought money solved everything. But then she appeared, hungry, soaked in rain, asking to pay later. Something cracked inside me. He took a breath. I offered her shelter. Just for one night. But she brought more warmth into my home than all the millions I've earned ever could. And then I learned she was my niece. My brother's daughter. The brother I lost without ever mending our rift. His voice faltered, but he continued. Your Honor, Lily doesn't just need shelter. She needs family. And for the first time in my life, I know what that means. I'm asking, no, I'm promising, to give her that. The courtroom was silent when he sat back down. Lily reached over and took his hand, her small fingers threading through his. Judge Carter reviewed the documents one last time. Then she looked up. Having considered all evidence, I find Mr. Evans's petition without merit. I grant full, permanent guardianship of Lily Evans to Mr. Brandon Whitmore. Gasps echoed. Mike Evans cursed under his breath and stormed out of the courtroom. Lily, still holding Brandon's hand, looked up at him with tears welling in her eyes. Does this mean I get to stay with you, forever? Brandon didn't trust himself to speak. He simply nodded, gripping her hand tighter. Outside, reporters waited. But Brandon didn't care about headlines anymore. As he lifted Lily into the waiting town car, her lavender dress fluttering like a flag of victory, he realized something profound. He hadn't just won a legal battle. He had claimed his second chance. A family. And this time, he wouldn't let it go. The once silent penthouse on Fifth Avenue now hummed with life. Laughter echoed from the kitchen, the scent of maple syrup and sizzling bacon floated through the air, and bright-colored sketches were taped to the stainless steel refrigerator, an appliance Brandon Whitmore hadn't touched in years. His sleek, cold world had become, inexplicably, a home. Brandon stood at the marble island, awkwardly flipping pancakes with a concentration that would have stunned his board of directors. Lily, sitting nearby in her wheelchair, giggled softly. That one looks like Florida, she teased, pointing at the irregular pancake on his spatula. He chuckled. Abstract culinary art. I'm expanding my portfolio. Mrs. Foster, watching from the hallway with folded arms and a knowing smile, murmured, You're not the man you were 6 months ago, Mr. Whitmore. And she was right. He had once been the man who scheduled every second of his day around mergers, acquisitions, and market forecasts. Now, his calendar was blocked every Thursday afternoon, not for billion-dollar calls, but for Lily's physical therapy sessions and school events. His boardroom had shifted from mahogany conference tables to kitchen counters and coloring books. The shift hadn't gone unnoticed. Victoria's voice had been the sharpest. You're letting emotions get in the way of reason, she had snapped during one particularly tense board meeting. You're not the Brandon Whitmore the industry respects. No, he wasn't. And for the first time, he didn't care. He saw Lily off to school every morning, personally overseeing the van with a lift, and had a standing appointment with Dr. Meyer, her physical therapist, twice a week. He sat beside her, counting the seconds she could stand with the bars, logging every inch she gained in her slow, stubborn march toward mobility. She was changing, too. At Westbrook Academy, Lily's confidence grew daily. Her teachers praised her brilliance, particularly in math and architectural design. But what caught Brandon off guard was how she channeled her creativity. Her latest project for the school's STEM fair was a playground design that would be accessible to children with all abilities. She'd named it Freedom Grove. This isn't just about ramps and wider pathways, she explained to Brandon one night over dinner, her eyes alight with passion. It's about dignity. About making a place where no kid feels like they have to sit out. Brandon was speechless. She was 9 years old, and she was already thinking about a world better than the one she inherited. When the STEM fair arrived, Brandon canceled a quarterly investor meeting without a second thought. In the school gym, surrounded by buzzing science projects and proud parents, he stood quietly beside Lily as she presented her miniature model to the judges. Her voice was steady. Her eyes clear. Her design detailed down to surface textures and inclusive equipment that accommodated children in wheelchairs or with sensory sensitivities. One judge, an urban planner, raised a brow in admiration. "You thought of things I hadn't even considered," he admitted. Brandon felt something swell in his chest that had nothing to do with pride in her intelligence, but everything to do with her heart. That evening, back in the penthouse, Lily placed a small silver ribbon on the bookshelf. "Second place," she said, shrugging. But it felt like first. Brandon crouched down to her level, resting his hand on hers. "It was first to me. And I have a feeling this is just the beginning." As they sat side by side, watching the city lights flicker beyond the glass, he realized this girl, his niece, his daughter in every way that mattered, had transformed him more completely than any market crash or merger ever could. She had taken the steel fortress around his heart and rebuilt it, carefully, lovingly, into something softer, stronger, and entirely new. Exactly 1 year to the day since their lives had collided in that small cafe on West 89th, Brandon Whitmore stood in the doorway of Westside Cafe, the scent of roasted beans and warm pastries pulling him back to a moment that had changed everything. At his side, Lily Evans Whitmore, now 10 and steady on her forearm crutches, smiled with quiet determination. The same cashier who had once hesitated over Lily's handful of crumpled bills blinked in disbelief. "Oh my goodness," she gasped, hand to her chest. "Look at you, walking." Lily beamed, the flush of pride coloring her cheeks. 3 months on crutches now," she said, adjusting her grip. "We thought we'd come back for cookies." "Anniversary cookies," Brandon added, his tone lighter than it had been in years. 1 year of being a family. The cashier's eyes welled with emotion as she handed them each a sugar-dusted cookie, refusing their money. "On the house today." They found a window seat and sat in comfortable silence, watching the morning crowd bustle past. Brandon had traded his tailored suit for jeans and a sweater. Even his famously combed back hair was tousled by the wind, the hard lines around his mouth softened by months of smiles. But the real transformation had taken place inside. Lily took a bite of her cookie, chewing slowly, then glanced at Brandon. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked, licking sugar from her thumb. "What if you'd walked away?" Brandon's expression sobered. "I think about it all the time," he admitted. "I almost did." "But you didn't," she said simply, meeting his eyes. "No. And I thank God every day I didn't." They left the cafe and walked slowly through Central Park. Lily's steps were deliberate, her movements less fluid than other children her age, but she carried herself with quiet grace. Brandon hovered just beside her, not to protect her, but to witness her strength. When they reached a bench overlooking the pond, Lily sank onto the wooden seat with a sigh of relief. Tired, she admitted. But good tired. Brandon chuckled and handed her a bottle of water. As she sipped, his eyes caught the edge of a newspaper sticking out of a nearby trash can. The headline on the visible page read, "Montgomery Investments leads accessibility innovation in U.S. markets." "That's our Miami project," Lily said, following his gaze. "Victoria says the design is ahead of schedule." Brandon smiled. "Your modified playground model made it real. You're not just changing your world, you're changing others, too." Lily nodded, pulling out her locket. She opened it slowly, revealing 3 photos tucked carefully inside: James and Rebecca Parker, the adoptive parents who had given her their love and name, Edward Montgomery, her biological father, and now, Brandon and Lily, standing side by side at her school STEM fair. "I put us in there last week," Lily said. "I wanted all 3 of my dads with me." Brandon cleared his throat. "Catherine finalized the paperwork yesterday," he said. "If you're ready to sign, it's official." Lily looked up, eyes wide. "Really? I'll be Lily Evans Whitmore?" He nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "You've been my daughter in every way that matters for a long time. This just makes it legal." She reached out and took his hand. "You chose me when you didn't have to. That's what makes it special." Brandon swallowed hard. "Best decision I ever made, Lily." They sat on the bench, watching families wander the park, mothers with strollers, kids flying kites, couples holding hands. Once, Brandon had seen that world as something distant, something other people lived. Now, he was part of it. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Lily leaned her head against his arm. "Do you think it was fate?" "I think," Brandon said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, "some families are born, and some are built." Lily smiled. "We built ours pretty well, huh?" He looked down at her and whispered, "The best thing I've ever built." We'd love to hear what you think. Drop a comment below and rate this story from 10 to 100. Tell us where you're watching from too. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. And if this touched your heart, check out more uplifting videos by clicking on the end screen now.